Welcome to the Trauma Informed Lens podcast. Each week, Matt, Curt, Jerry, and the occasional special guest explore how the trauma-informed paradigm challenges traditional beliefs and approaches concerning a wide variety of areas. This podcast addresses psychological trauma in an educational manner and is not designed to replace mental health treatment. If anything in this podcast makes you feel uncomfortable or anxious, please talk to a mental health professional.
Welcome, friends, to episode 72 of the Trauma Informed Lens podcast. I'm here with Curt and Jerry today, and we're going to talk about the concept of small t trauma, and really talk about the language behind it, what we're trying to describe with it, some of the science behind it, and just sort of take a look at this concept. I know we talked way back when, I think in episode 2 when we defined trauma, but we didn't get into it that much. So we're going to explore that concept today, have a great discussion around it, see what conclusions the three of us come to. So as always, we start out with our bright, shiny objects of the week. And Curt, I will start with you this week. What are you thinking about?
Well, with the bright, shiny object today is the sun, because it's out. It's cold, but the sun is shining, and that's great.
Yes.
We got a few inches of snow at my house, so I was glad to see a little sunshine this morning. And I'm actually in northern Colorado today, so the drive from Denver up here was just gorgeous. Seeing the sun rise as I was driving up, it was just absolutely gorgeous. Snow covered everything. It was one of those great Colorado scenes. It was a great day to be here.
Well, glad you're there safe, too.
Me too.
Jerry, what about you? What are you thinking about this week?
Going along with the theme of it's cold out there, one of the things that's nice about when it's cold and snowy is everybody goes out and shovels. And so in a way, you get connected to your neighbors and your community. Everybody's out and people are in a good mood. So went out this morning early and shoveled the walks and had a talk with my neighbor who I haven't actually seen for several weeks. It's almost like Groundhog Day. People come out of the holes and kind of do it. So, when it's cold and snowy, the silver lining is it's rich relational time.
Last night I was doing the same thing, shoveling my walks. And my neighbor came over with her snowblower as I was shoveling and, hauling. And she walked over and smiled at me. That's all she said was, "I love my snowblower."
Was that a small T?
I thought it was too loud for me to say, "Well, I love it too. Why don't you just do the whole thing?"
That's awesome. So my small t time, I just want to kind of shout out to my friends at Peak Vista down in Colorado Springs. I'm doing a series of 6 trainings, which is always fun to really get some meaningful time with some folks, and there's some coaching involved. And it's really cool to see, when you have a physician, a nurse, an administrator, all kind of in the room together, again, with a lot of service providers, and just from the different disciplines, sort of really getting on fire about trauma-informed care and really addressing, changing policies, procedures, practices to get in line with some of this material. So it was my second of 6 trainings down there. I just had a blast, and looking forward to going back a little later this month as well. So just hi to all my friends down there. So let's talk a little bit about small t trauma. Now, I'll throw out just a little bit of my definition of small t trauma. When I train, I use the definition of living in high-stress environments and in the shadow of the threat of traumatic events occurring at any time. And, to give some idea of kind of why I started to use this, because I was hesitant to use it at first because big T trauma, small T trauma, I didn't really didn't really see, I mean, can we just call it trauma and kind of go from there? You know, the one piece that I started to really think about this a little bit differently was some of the research around the cytokine release when we're under intense stress. And one of the things that we see, obviously during a traumatic event, cortisol, that stress hormones release, is also norepinephrine, adrenaline, those chemicals are released. And so there's events though, like homelessness, that might not happen like 2:00 on Tuesday, but are something that follows an individual over a longer period of time. Poverty might be one of those. Maybe if you think about the adverse childhood experiences, you know, some of the ACEs, living with somebody with an untreated mental illness, or a substance abuse issue. Again, not something that necessarily happens at a specific time and place, but happens over a period of time. And when they studied those folks, the cytokine piece, that if it stays in your body for long periods of time, which I believe the kind of concept of small T trauma is trying to describe, we know that it creates inflammation in the gut and in the brain, which is really now being linked to a lot of mental illnesses as well. So, you know, I thought that it was distinct enough to sort of give it a separate label, because I think we're describing a slightly different phenomena. But if you look at the long-term outcomes for neurobiological health, mental health, medical health, just as devastating when we look at the impact of it long term. Jerry, I know you've made some points in a couple recent episodes where you sort of don't I think, the terminology of small T trauma. So I would love to learn from you kind of what you're thinking. If you don't like that terminology, do you use kind of other terminologies to kind of describe what we're trying to get to with small T?
So, you know, I have not, first of all, I think that people sometimes, when they hear the terminology, especially when you're talking to audiences who aren't familiar with the literature, walk away and think of a trauma as something small. And that it's the language, and also when I'm working with clients, they tend to minimize their experiences. And so I have found that using the terminology of a small T tends to not really communicate effectively the significant impact that these pattern of experiences, prolonged stress, has on their bodies. And so I tended to use the SAMHSA's 3 E's of looking at the event, looking at the experience, and then looking at the effect of that experience on them, as a way to kind of help them begin to explore what you would call a small T, to kind of looking at that. So, and we also know that it's not necessarily the event. And when we look at small T's, people tend to look at the event size as opposed to the impact that those have on them. So just working with clients, have not wanted to use that terminology. Although I do think that when you read the literature, it's very valid and useful. But it's just that in terms of helping to kind of validate and kind of highlight for my clients not necessarily the size of it, but really the pattern of the exposure is more the issue. And that when we know that somebody has exposure to moderate, predictable, somewhat controllable, it increases people's sense of resilience. And when experiences are unpredictable, and prolonged, and they tend to increase vulnerability. And so that's more of the language that I struggled with, and I used it, but it has not found it as useful as helping people really look at what's their experience. And when I've gotten into their experience, it's not really small. That's the piece, is that it's pretty significant when we begin to look at and help them to look at the issue of relational poverty, the issue of chronic exposure, the issue of lack of both internal and external availability of resources. So that's really why I tended to stay away from using that language.
Yeah.
One of the components of that is I think there's a learning component to that I think makes some of the small t or complex chronic trauma even more insidious, in that when we think about processes of learning, one of them is generalization. And that when we've had so many events that then can become essentially cues for different bodily responses that are happening outside of conscious awareness, there's a lot more vulnerability that gets generated there from just an exposure to environmental events perspective. A lot more things that could trigger a dissociative response without being the cortex being aware of that, or being able to put a story to it. So the body can become a much more confusing place when we're trying to put stories to and put context to physiological responses and regulatory responses and emotional responses. There becomes much less of a coherent view of those things just from a straight classical conditioning, respondent conditioning standpoint. And I think that often can lead to this feeling of increased vulnerability, and really making the clients that I have treated very kind of wary and reticent to try anything new or even engage socially, because they can never predict really when their body is going to respond a certain way. And it's really difficult for them to make any prediction about that. So it creates a really kind of insidious form of vulnerability.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it's the struggle that I had was, and one of the reasons I've used that term, and Jerry, I think your points I agree with your points, is that, it's an interesting working of language, because we're not calling the trauma small. We're kind of putting instead of a capital T, a small t. And so, some of this is like, okay, how did we get here? And I think that's a good question to always ask. The thing that I was struggling with more than anything else when I started to integrate this terminology was, so events like, two big ones that just are on the top of my mind. One I think, well, both could hit children, but just the experience of homelessness, and really how in some ways you live in a state which is, excuse me, incredibly vulnerable. And yet for a lot of folks, waking up in a shelter on a Tuesday is just a normal Tuesday. So there's, you look at the person, and obviously they've got some struggles because they're not housed, but if you look at them next Tuesday, it's kind of almost the same thing. And some folks live in these high stress, vulnerable situations sometimes for decades, and it does become their new normal, but there's still a cost to that. The other one that really kind of struck me too, and I don't think this is necessarily a small t trauma for everybody, but I think it would have been for me growing up, is, working with military families and the deployments that, I try to imagine myself as a child and knowing my mom or dad were going to a war zone for a year, and not knowing every morning when I woke up if they'd be alive at the end of the day. And so, again, there might not be, you could say the traumatic event might be them leaving, but I don't think that's where, again, we see the psychological and then the biological damage is done by this. So it kind of allows me to talk about, that homelessness is traumatic, even though that normal Tuesday might not traumatize anybody. So trying to find some language to help people know that these long-term high-stress situations do have a pretty huge toll on individuals' lives.
Yeah, I think when you look at it historically, where small T's really served a purpose to it really was a challenge to the original PTSD diagnosis that you had to have some type of event outside ordinary experiences to create this trauma. And what we know is that there is lots of everyday, both natural events that are occurring, both societal events that are occurring, and relational events that are occurring, right? And so, trying to challenge the thinking at the time that really PTSD was associated with this kind of war event or a tornado or something, that really served its purpose. And I do think, as far as training goes, it really is an important concept to kind of get through. I just haven't found in my interpersonal interactions with my clients that's the best model to kind of use for them. Although it really does. When you hear their life stories, they really, as Curt talked about, they really talk about these really significant relational ruptures and injuries that they've experienced along the way that in some ways change their expectations of the world. And when their expectations of the world changed, it changed them physiologically, it changed the sensitivity to the nervous system, but it also changed their behavior. So they tend to elicit responses from the world that are in some ways reinforcing of those kind of experiences. So I think it's an important concept to teach, but it really does, it does help when we in some ways validate someone's experience that, as you said, mom or dad going away for a year, if the parent that's staying home is so overwhelmed and scared too that they can't kind of be present with that child to kind of be with them to do it, it's not just the separation, but it's the relation. It's the lack of a more mature, better regulated nervous system to help that child manage that situation.
Yeah.
So in a way, it's a very complicated interactional process, and the original definitions of trauma weren't interactional, right? They really were just occurring within that person's nervous system. But we know that our brains and bodies are either regulated or dysregulated within the context of relational interactions.
Yeah.
So with in your thinking, Matt, about small T trauma, I think of single event trauma as a word and a category of events, and then chronic, and then complex.
Yeah.
Are you thinking that the small T is the chronic and the complex categories in that?
Not necessarily, because I think, and one of our guests from England gave me the word compound trauma, that I kind of do complex and compound trauma, but I just like that kind of language. So I've started to use that. But, really with the small T trauma, and I've tried to think this through in quite a way. So, in some ways, when I see complex or compound trauma, it's usually a combination of, what we kind of call a big T traumatic event, but then the small T underlying thing. So, a lot of times I think about a child in an abusive situation, and this is an example I use in a training that, let's say dad gets drunk on the way home from work, comes home drunk, becomes verbally aggressive, and then becomes abusive with both mom and child. So that historically what we would call big T trauma or traumatic event. There's abuse that happens. Again, we don't know necessarily the biological reactions of those two, but for most people that would be a big T trauma with domestic violence and child abuse. But one of the things is like, okay, so that happens at, Tuesday at 6 p.m. and it ended at Tuesday at 6:30 p.m. And so the traumatic event happens there. One of the other things that I really kind of think about with complex or compound trauma is, when's the next time that kid wakes up in the morning and his first thought or mom's first thought is not, is dad going to get drunk tonight and be abusive again? And so, you know, on one hand, I use the small T trauma to describe high stress, biologically damaging situations that don't necessarily have a big event that causes it. It's more of that long-term thing. But, you know, my thinking around complex compound trauma is it's kind of that mixture. So I think about homelessness. Yeah, not having a house is incredibly stressful, but there's also so much vulnerability there as well. Is you don't know who's going to, you know, we know assaults are much higher for individuals experiencing homelessness. We know, you know, if everything you own is in a shopping cart and that shopping cart gets stolen, you know, and so it's kind of a way to describe that there's this threat out there. It might not even ever manifest in some ways. But it just allows to talk about, I think, in some ways, the threat of trauma or living in these high stress situations where there's not an identifiable event. And that's what I hear, too, from you, Jerry, is like, you know, just because it's something we can't say, hey, that happened at Tuesday at 6 o'clock, doesn't mean there's not sort of a traumatic reaction to it. So, you know, could you have complex compound trauma without any small T trauma? Yeah, I think that's possible. You could also have small T trauma without having big T trauma. I think for most people, what we see, and most people that hit high levels of services, we're talking about a mix of both of those things coming together.
Jerry, you were talking about relational events, and that kind of fell into this category of small T, whether it's lack of an attuned caregiver or consistently stressed out caregiver. I'm curious a little more in just your experience of having involved with treating so many people who've gone through those kind of things, seeing so many things. If you could just talk a little bit about what are some of the impacts there that you see, and that's something that I at least I hear you talk about a lot. So I'm always curious to hear a little bit more about it from your standpoint.
So from a developmental perspective, really, if we think about the way that this child is born into the world, and really everything is overwhelming, right? The sounds, the light, the temperature, the experiencing of hunger, which they've never felt before, to kind of looking at that, right? And because of our dependency on the availability of someone outside of us to respond to us, that our nervous system gets regulated by the interactional process that goes on. So that when I'm getting overwhelmed, I need someone to kind of respond to me, to feed me. When I'm cold, I need someone to put a blanket on me. When I'm need to be picked up and rocked and moved, I need somebody to do it. And so those hundreds of thousands of sensory somatic interactions serve to regulate my nervous system. And so that the stress that I experience is increasing my capacity to manage stress, but it's also being regulated, right? So if we think about that, and then as I get a little older, I begin to develop the capacity to move away from my caregiver. But when I get out in the world, if things get too scary or too overwhelming, or I fall and get hurt, I come back and I can so that I have this experience of my nervous system getting activated in moderate, predictable patterns that increase my ability to handle arousal states. I also develop expectations of the world that if something happens, I'm either going to be able to manage it or somebody will be there to help me. However, when a child is in an environment where either their states are responded to by anger or to do it, or that the adults in the who are responsible for caregiving are so really overwhelmed with their own experiences. I'm left in high levels of stress for a prolonged amount of time. And it's unpredictable. I don't know when my needs are going to be met. So this sense of intensity and the pattern of this sense of I don't know how long this is going to last tends to increase the sensitivity to my nervous system as opposed to building tolerance in my nervous system. They're kind of looking at that, right? So that later on, now I have this nervous system that hasn't been well regulated. It hasn't been, I can't handle high levels of stress. So now, later on, now I go in and I'm exposed to what we would call normal developmental demands. For one child, that's a manageable stimuli that I'm able to get activated, but eventually learn how to kind of manage and master, and may actually find some pleasure in engaging in that. Where this other child has the same exact event demand on them, but because their nervous systems are sensitized and their expectations of themselves in the world, they get overwhelmed by the same event, right? And so if we were to kind of look at one child, we would say that event is, why is that child this child's more resilient, right? And this other child here. And so if you go all the way up to people who experience bullying, people who experience social media kind of harassment, people who experience failure in school, if we just look at those events, we would in some ways say that those are normal things that children have to manage when they get older. However, the clients that I've worked with, their experience of those events are overwhelming. And so really when we begin to look at this concept of trauma, if we want to kind of look at something that's life-threatening and overwhelming and do it as the criteria for having been exposed to trauma, we're going to miss all of this. So, Curt, sometimes we have these kids who appear that they have sensitized nervous systems, they're acting out, and then you talk to a therapist and they say, well, they have no trauma in their life. I did a history, there's no trauma in their lives, right? And so there's this incongruency between what we're seeing in this child's or this young adult's behavior and reactions and what the social history talks about. So really, as I begin to know that individual and I begin to listen to their experience of the world, I begin to hear what Matt would be calling small traumas, right? I begin to be sensitive to those experiences and understand that, being left in your room or alone, or dad going away overseas and mom being overwhelmed herself. But that's not the narrative. They don't have, oh, mom was overwhelmed and to do it, is I was left alone. And so that narrative that gets created, or the lack of narrative, right, is really what, and so through the therapeutic interactions, we begin to kind of, one, validate their experience, and two, is create that kind of more coherent narrative to explain these experiences.
So something I'm hearing there of a thread, right, that we tend to, I think, see in kind of everyday existence, not even in treatment or in services, but just kind of in natural human relationships, is that we all get in situations where sometimes we're not using verbal language to communicate, we're acting things out.
Right.
And one of the ways that can get generated is all the way back to this early experience of being able to regulate your internal nervous system. And it's a thread that kind of goes all the way through that. So we're looking around and we all go through it, right? There are times when I'm like not managing my emotions well and I'm acting stuff out. And then there are times when I'm managing it well and my ability to verbalize it is increased. and that helps me to manage it. So just as we think even about, it's not just services here that happens. This is like how human relationships often work. And that comes right tied back to this early experience of relational health. And that leads to optimal functioning later, much different functioning when we think about how we relate to each other, even as adults.
Well, and I think just to add some of the discussion, I think, there's also the other piece of it is what if you're sort of I think ideally we would have good schools, safe neighborhoods. So if you have a good home life, then that translates really well as success. I know we've all worked with kids who, when they stepped out their door, their home might have been okay. Any family struggling with poverty has more stress, but it doesn't make poverty in of itself. It's kind of like the deployment. If mom's there or dad's there left, when the other parents deployed to help regulate, talk to the kid every night, it might not have any residual effects overall. They may come through that experience, as Jerry said earlier, more resilient. But I also think about the kids that, sometimes a traumatic brain, like an overactive amygdala, always being hyper aroused, especially for the kids that I worked with in gangs, that was a really great brain for them to have. That was great when they walked out, in there. I think about, people that are deployed and their deployment actually goes really well. They were never under threat, but they knew every day, they didn't know where the sniper bullet might come from, even though it never came. And then there was no big T event for them or their other folks in their unit. So it's interesting is, and this I think is where my social justice fire gets burning on this is, some of these kids coming out of chaotic homes actually in some ways gave them the brain necessary to survive their situation too. So there's this, again, with the secondary trauma of just being raised in some of the neighborhoods my kids were raised in that I worked with, that they had to go out every day and wonder if they were going to be okay. And again, on a Tuesday, no big T trauma, yet that was in the back of their mind the whole time. So I think, again, that there's this, and Jerry, I think you did a good job saying we kind of missed this early on. And I think you're absolutely right with that is, there might be a threat of life-threatening, but that threat never manifests itself into an event. But yet, again, we see the science coming out of these events too that are just absolutely devastating if they don't get help they need or find safer ways or safer places to exist. And yeah.
Matt, I think Curt talked about it, which is a really important concept they talked about, is that this issue of generalization, right? Is that if I'm in a war zone and I'm a sniper, being hypervigilant is an adaptive response.
Yeah.
Right? But if I go home and I'm in my family and I'm with my children and doing
the grocery store and
I generalize that state and that way of being into that. The issue is the lack of flexibility and the overgeneralization of that, right? So that the initial response for those children living on the street to kind of do it may be very adaptive.
Yeah.
But if they go to work and they
or school
or school and have an overactive, then that becomes problematic, right? For them to kind of look at that. So when we understand the way that the nervous system works, right, to kind of looking at that, I can then begin to respond to that young man who's kind of overreactive in school in a way that both validates their experience, but also helps them understand that this is an overgeneralization to this, right? That's problematic. I can hold both sides of that piece, right? But if we don't even acknowledge in the definition that something could in fact be experienced as trauma, then we deal with that individual later on in a very different way.
Yeah.
Right? So you're the people who kind of began to talk about small T traumas was really beginning to help us understand that it just wasn't a war veteran or somebody who was sexually assaulted who are going to be demonstrating these kinds of behaviors, so that we can begin to develop strategies and compassion for people along the range. So, your thought about somebody coming in who's homeless. Mm-hmm. How do I begin to understand that their manipulative behavior in interacting with me or whatever it may be is very adaptive to them? Yeah. But it's not adaptive to this interaction.
Yeah.
Right? And then I have to both hold you, but then begin to help you to link and differentiate between what you're dealing on the street and what you're dealing when you walk in the door. Mm-hmm. So kind of looking at that piece, right? And I think these are all important concepts, and it's part of the development of our field and knowledge. Mm-hmm. Remember in 1980, when that diagnosis was first put into we didn't have a lot of the neurobiological understanding of what was going on. So I think that, we've come a long way in kind of helping us to kind of look at that. I just personally, I like the concept of small T traumas to kind of do it. I just haven't found it very useful in my work with clients to kind of talk about it that way.
What about the other side of that coin, Jerry, or Matt, to you too? Calling something trauma can sometimes, at least I found, I wonder if you do, get a reaction from a client in that they don't like it being called trauma because that has a connotation of weakness along with it. Mm-hmm. But even that, there's one side of saying small t is like not giving it enough, not paying enough attention to it. And then there's the other side of even calling chronic stressors or relational poverty trauma can get a reaction because we call it trauma. Any thoughts about that side of it?
The one thing I have, and Jerry, I know you do individual work more than I do. I get to train, and I get a chance next week in Fort Worth to do this, people in services, so that we're trying to help. And my experience from that, my kind of psychoeducational role that I now play when I put my therapist hat back on at times, what the feedback I've got is that it's like, thank you. It's like, okay, now I can say, yeah, struggling with homelessness, growing up in a home. It wasn't just that one event or two events that happened, but it was just that underlying level of craziness in my home. And so I've really seen expanding our definition of trauma for the most part useful in that specific environment. I think Jerry's points on individual care are also well taken, but when I'm just kind of educating folks on, okay, what is trauma and throwing those definitions out, I think expanding it, again, one of the big pieces of feedback I get from my trainings with folks in services is I realize I'm not a bad person for the first time in my life. So, seeing that some of these kind of non-events but ongoing situations also are potentially traumatizing, seems to be part of them, that initial, and I only usually get people for 3 hours at most, that initial change in narrative as you spoke about, Curt.
In response to that, your question, it's a good question. Mm-hmm. First of all, that's thought-provoking. The first thing that came to my mind is, when I used to give Rorschach tests, I'd show them an ink blot, and they would project all sorts of things on that ink blot. And it wasn't wrong, but it helped me to understand how they organized their experience. Did they look at details? Did they look at large pieces? Did they look at the color? Did they look at the shading? Did they write? What was there about this experience, right? So if if I say this word trauma, even Matt might have it. When I remember when Matt was on his thing about Sandra Bloom and people hate trauma and they're overwhelmed with trauma, right? It's like he had this affective response to it, right? And so the issue for me really is if I say that and somebody says that symbolizes weakness for me, and that I don't want it to be trauma to do it, is I try to stay there and say to them, tell me a little bit more about what that experience is for you, right? Help me understand this from your perspective. and then I adjust my own language to be more incongruent with how they see that.
Yeah.
But if they're, in their lives, being weak was scary and made them vulnerable, right? And that is a really important part of the interactional process that I need to understand. So, when you're in these, whether you're in a group or you're in a individual, is that people are hearing the same sensory information. Their ears are, but they're putting meaning to that experience, right? And so it's our job really to begin to help us understand the meaning of that experience for that individual. So I think that's an interesting concept you said, is some people will experience being traumatized as weak, right? How long did it go along that soldiers were told that they had PTSD or whatever, to kind of look at that? There was a cultural piece of that piece. There was an institutional, there's an institutional kind of benefit from telling people that it's their fault that something's happening to them, to kind of looking at, right? So there's a lot of really rich material there when somebody says to you, I don't want to be traumatized. That means that I'm weak.
Right.
So that's really...
I remember well being a soldier and having people and describing this myself. We would talk about, are you going to get PTSD or not? I mean, really the question should have been when, not if.
Yeah.
And one of the ways that it was described as, if people did experience symptoms, they would describe it as, I got PTSD because I couldn't handle it.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Right. And that was a way that they thought about it that was really kind of poignant.
Right.
Well, and then the tragedy of if that's kind of the culture, which, I've been thinking a lot about training when I've been training police departments, because you also look at the suicide rates of there. And I think there's a very similar reaction to that is, oh, there's something wrong with me. And that's a traumatic reaction, right? You don't have to go to war or be a police officer to have that reaction from trauma. But I think when the culture that you're in really reinforces that to some way, that, yeah, you are weak if you're mentally ill kind of thing, and don't ask for help. That's sort of we're putting toxic things together there in what we're seeing just as a tragic way.
So that's an interesting, right? That's an interesting issue, right? Because I have this experience. I'm feeling overwhelmed and I'm feeling vulnerable. And then I have another part of myself being critical of that part that's feeling that way, right? And so there's this dissociation internally, right? And so you can imagine that culturally, but even growing up, if I cry and response to my crying is stop crying, I'll give you something to cry about.
Yep.
Right? How does that kind of, in some ways, make me have to dissociate that part of me and put it onto somebody else, right? Or not even recognize it in myself, the kind of looking at that piece.
Yeah.
So I think you really raised an important part when you said is, what happens when somebody says, I don't like that, I'm not traumatized, is there's a part of them that's traumatized and a part of them that is saying, I don't want to own that piece of me. Yeah. To kind of looking at that, which is a really important dynamic to help that person become more integrated. Mm-hmm. In terms of how do I integrate that part of me that's small and vulnerable and hurt with the part of me that has to be strong and competent and capable and kind of manage things, right? That's a really important therapeutic challenge.
Yeah. I mean, it really highlights a coping mechanism that
right.
we do. And we learn to survive that way. Mm-hmm. And so those can be very, very frightening coping strategies and things to actually move away from. They become so ingrained and habitual.
Right.
If I give that up, how am I going to deal with the world? And I've heard so many, especially young girls who engage in self-injury, who say that, I can't, how am I going to deal with the world if I give this up? I can't do it.
Right.
Well, and I think it was such a powerful thing. I actually left a job because of this. My first job ever outside selling Cutco knives for like 6 months, which was terrible.
I did that. I did that.
Yeah, I was terrible. You were probably good at it. I bet you were like a
I
star
only
knife
saw-
seller.
I was in college. How many college kids are going to buy 300?
Yeah, how many people in a psychological graduate school are also able to afford that? Yeah. But one of the things that I think when we talk about police officers, we talk about soldiers, one of the things that made me think about is working with the gang members. We just discharged them right back into their small T trauma. So it's like, okay, I'm going to help you. And I see this in my work in the military base. It's not just you have one deployment, then you're done being deployed. The likelihood is you're going to be redeployed. So you come home and you know that, again, whether we call it small T trauma or whatever, that potential trauma, life and death situations out there again, I think it sets people up. I mean, I was just pissed off that what was I supposed to do as a therapist? Was I supposed to address these states that these kids were using to survive the environment that we were going to discharge them right back to? So I left that job to start a housing program so those kids had a different choice if they didn't want to go back to their community. But it's just like, I think that again, what the small T helped me understand is, hey, they need these coping skills to survive. I didn't have this language at the time, but it's like, okay, we're going to expect somebody experiencing homelessness to magically get up one day and go get a job knowing at the end of the interview they still don't have a place to shower, sleep, or put their clothes. So, I think that at least it gives us some deeper understanding, and hopefully we can think logically about some of these services that we try to provide when we think about a small T as well. Let me ask a final question because we're kind of hitting our time here. It sounds like we agree with the concept and that the concept's important. Is there a better language we can use? Because that's really what's kind of sticking in and I love to change my slides up. So, is there a better, I mean, we could say traumatic event for big T trauma. I mean, that's kind of an easy one, but is there, I used to use hyper stress, but this is more than stress. So I wonder if there's any thoughts of, is there a better word or phrase than small T? I don't think small T is demeaning it, but I totally get your point, Jerry, that it does without trying at least to say, hey, this is less than that.
Matt, I think that it's according when you, I would assume even for you, when you do a training and there's 60 people in there, what are people walking out the door with? What do you want them to walk out the door with, right?
Yeah.
Is that if you say there's a big T and a small T, people are going to take that into their own meaning or whatever it is, unless you give them some understanding of what you're trying to communicate.
Absolutely.
Right? Because that's social interaction. What you say and what I say is, right? So it isn't necessarily changing your slides, but really what is it you really are looking for them to understand by using this terminology for you? I get why it was originally created, and I support that. Is for you, what is the takeaway?
The takeaway is being in high stress situations. Again, it gives me a way to say experiencing homelessness for the vast majority of people is traumatic, even though there might not be an event on a Tuesday, Wednesday. They may go through 3-4 weeks without or more, maybe even a year without a big T trauma, but there's a traumatic response in our biology around that. So I want to expand people's thinking from this has got to be an overwhelming event that overwhelms your nervous system to this could be an ongoing high level of stress environment that also will have impacts on your ability to really be successful with your folks if you don't take this into your account in your thinking about folks and their experience.
It's an interesting point, Matt. You're making me think of some of my old grad school days learning about different types of, the learning process and different types of learning. And one of the things that we talked about was that there are very, very limited situations in which we get what we call one trial learning. That one repetition of an experience results in a change in our system, or in how we act, or how we behave, or how we think, or any of those things over a significant period of time. And that's one of the ones we talk about is taste aversion. Mm-hmm. So you can eat something that tastes bad and it makes you sick one time, and you can never do it again. It's one of the few types of single trial learning. Everything else requires multiple trials. You have to have a lot of repetitive experience in order to learn. And that is I think the concept of the small T trauma is all these repetitive experiences, even though there wasn't one that was a single trial learning episode. It's the insidious nature of the repetition that actually kind of creates in some ways, even a more intractable, a more difficult problem often.
Yeah. And I think when we think about like epigenetics and other things as well, again, if you're under that high stress environment for long periods of time, your DNA is changing, all those things as well. So yeah, it's just, it's kind of like, I feel like I need to communicate the point, but
so how does that sound to you, that really it's the pattern, the frequency, the duration, and the pattern of exposures that in some ways kind of changes the sensitivity of the nervous system to kind of respond to kind of, right? Is like, that's really what, so it doesn't have to be a one-time large event.
Right.
What you're saying is it could be the pattern of exposures that changes the sensitivity of the nervous system to be, which then changes our expectation, which changes our behavior, kind of all those things.
Yeah.
So I think that's really the important piece, is not just putting a label on something, but helping people really understand what that label means.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right? And then people can kind of do it. I think that's the takeaway today is, I have found when we just use that label, people walk away with, oh, so, you get, I can tell you in the store, sorry, we don't have the ketchup, that kind of ketchup you have, and that's traumatizing for you, right? Right? That's not really what we're talking about.
No.
I mean, that's an over-focus on the event, as using the event, the type of event to categorize rather than the impact of
Exactly.
Yeah. And from a trainer perspective, it's good to have, I mean, the thing I like about small T and big T is you kind of walk out remembering it. And I think if you have a label for something, you're more likely to remember the concept. But we have to make sure our labels make sense. So maybe we could throw this out to our listeners as well, is, do you have a better word for small T trauma? Matt wants to change his slide. Do you have a better word for small T trauma?
Put that into your life change for the next 6 weeks.
Right, and the important thing is that if exposure to pattern repetitive experiences of being stressed without the availability of adequate internal or external resources is negative, then the pattern of exposure to positive experiences that are regulating could have a long-term benefit for you, right? Which is, in some ways, why we do therapy, why we have programs, is that we can actually look at if we dose the interaction in the right way with enough space between those and have a pattern of positive experiences, we can also change the nervous system.
Yeah, absolutely. And that gets us on to the fun epigenetic stuff, which I think is devastating when you think about the small T's. But again, we can use that same science to help people really change those traumatic experiences and stressful situations into resiliency and wisdom. And that's always a great way to end an episode. So awesome. Great discussion. You guys gave me a lot to think about. And again, if our audience has any suggestions, better labels for big T and small T trauma, I'm sure somebody's using something out there that we would love. So throw those our way. You can find show notes, videos, everything else at traumainformedlens.org. And next week, we're going to start for episode 73. We're going to start looking at trauma-informed workplaces. We're going to have this as an ongoing thing. We might have some guests scattered in there. as well. But just looking at some things about, okay, how do we take this and think about what this means for our organization? What's this mean for how we interact with one another within the organizational context? And I'm excited. That's been a passion of mine. Pretty much, Jerry showed me the ACE study, and that was my second follow-up question. Was, what's this mean for us? So I'm excited to get on that role as well. So everybody have a great week, and we'll see you next week. Thanks so much.